Nicholas Rader had been on the Mississippi River countless times before, but today it felt different. The constant hum of the water's movement usually provided a peaceful backdrop to his quiet, solitary fishing trips. But this morning, as he sat at the helm of his small boat, he couldn't ignore the nagging discomfort in his chest. Something wasn't right with the river. The water was still moving, but it felt clogged. Not just with silt and current, but with something more dangerous: plastic. Nicholas had been a fisherman for over 20 years, a man of the river in every sense. It was his livelihood, his quiet refuge, and the place where he'd found solace after the loss of his wife many years ago. He knew the river intimately, its bends, its deep pools, its subtle currents, and even its moods. Today, though, the river felt more like an old friend who had grown sick, and the sickness was now manifesting before him. As his boat cut through the water, Nicholas could see debris floating along the surface, moving with the current in a lazy, aimless drift. Plastic bags, bottles, discarded packaging, junk that had been carelessly thrown away by people who had long ago stopped caring. It was an image all too familiar to him. Over the years, he had seen more and more trash accumulating in the water, clogging up the river's arteries. But today, the sheer volume of it was impossible to ignore. "Damn it," Nicholas muttered under his breath, shaking his head as his boat glided past yet another pile of floating debris. It wasn't just the river that had become polluted. It was the world around it, too. He had long been aware of the growing pollution problem, but it was never so evident as it was today. He pulled up his fishing net and let the boat drift slowly with the current. Normally, the fish he caught in these waters were plump and healthy, but recently, he had noticed fewer bites, and the fish that were caught often seemed off, less vibrant, sluggish, as if the water itself was sick. It saddened him to think of how much the river had changed, and how much it continued to deteriorate. It was then that something caught his eye. A flash of white, standing out starkly against the dirty waters. At first, Nicholas thought it was just another piece of trash, a white plastic bag caught in the current. But as he looked closer, his heart sank. It was a swan, a large, graceful bird, but something was wrong. It was struggling, flapping its wings in erratic movements. Nicholas quickly brought the boat closer, his gut twisting with a sense of dread. The swan's neck was tangled in a large plastic bag, restricting its movements. The bird was trapped, unable to break free. It flapped harder, splashing water around, but it was no use. The bag around its neck was too tight, pulling at its throat and making it difficult for the bird to breathe. For a moment, Nicholas simply stared. He'd seen plenty of dead birds caught in trash before, floating lifelessly along the river, but this was different. The swan wasn't dead yet. It was still fighting, still alive, still trying to escape. The sight stirred something inside Nicholas, a mix of anger and helplessness. Without thinking, he jumped into action, throwing the boat into gear and steering it closer to the struggling bird. He wasn't sure how he would get close enough without scaring it away, but he knew he had to try. The swan's frantic movements grew more desperate as he approached, but Nicholas moved with a calm determination. He'd seen a lot in his years as a fisherman, but there was something about the sight of this bird, caught, struggling and helpless, that made him feel more urgent than ever before. The swan's eyes locked with his for a split second, as if it somehow understood what was happening. Then, with one final powerful flap of its wings, it was caught in the plastic again, its body jerking helplessly in the water. Nicholas reached for a pair of thick gloves in the boat's storage compartment, his hands shaking slightly as he slid them on. His breath came in short, sharp gasps, his heart racing with the awareness that time was running out for the bird. The swan's neck was trapped tight, and without intervention, it wouldn't last long in the polluted water. He had to act now. Stepping carefully, Nicholas leaned over the edge of the boat, keeping one hand on the boat's sides to steady himself. With a steadying breath, he grabbed hold of the plastic bag, trying to avoid frightening the bird further. The swan, frightened, jerked back, but Nicholas gently but firmly pulled the plastic free, unraveling it from around the bird's neck. The swan squawked in alarm, but Nicholas kept his grip tight, unwilling to let go. Minutes felt like hours as he carefully worked the bag loose, the bird's frantic efforts only slowing when it realized the plastic was finally coming off. Nicholas worked quickly, using his strong hands to untangle the debris from the bird's body. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the swan was free. Nicholas exhaled deeply, his muscles sore from the strain. The bird, now free of the choking plastic, was breathing heavily, but it was alive. For a long moment, Nicholas simply stared at the swan in silence, his heart still pounding. The bird was no longer struggling. It slowly flapped its wings, testing them, as if unsure whether to trust them again. Nicholas couldn't help but smile as he watched the bird's wings unfurl, the tension in its body slowly releasing. It was a long, slow process, but it was happening. Finally, with a few tentative beats, the swan lifted into the air, soaring higher and higher as it left the boat behind. For a moment, Nicholas simply sat there in awe, watching the bird disappear into the sky. He had saved it. He had made a difference. It wasn't much, but it was enough for today. As he sat back down in the boat, he couldn't shake the feeling that something deep inside him had shifted. The swan's flight, the bird's freedom, it felt like a sign, like he was supposed to do more. The river had given him something once, and now it seemed like it was asking for something in return. Nicholas let out a slow breath. He knew what he had to do. The river and its creatures needed his help, and he wouldn't turn his back on them again. Nicholas sat silently in his boat, still staring at the place where the swan had disappeared into the sky. The air around him felt different now, charged with a new purpose that he hadn't felt in a long time. The Mississippi River, which he had come to know and love, had always been a place of solace for him. But now it seemed like a battleground, a place where every ripple in the water and every current held more meaning than before. He had witnessed firsthand the damage done to this waterway. He had seen how it suffered, and in a way, the swan's desperate struggle was a symbol of that suffering. The river was choking on the plastic waste, and so were the creatures that called it home. As he sat there in this quiet aftermath of the rescue, his mind raced. He thought about the countless animals that must have suffered the same fate. The fish, the birds, the mammals, all at the mercy of the garbage that humans had carelessly dumped into the river. It made him feel guilty, angry, and helpless all at once. How many more swans had been caught in plastic bags or tangled in fishing line? How many had perished without anyone ever knowing? Nicholas ran a hand over his face. He had always been a fisherman. He knew how to catch fish and how to read the river, but he had never thought about how deeply the river was suffering. In some ways, he had taken it for granted. It was just always there, a constant presence in his life. But now he could no longer ignore what he had seen. He had to do something. He didn't know what that something was, but he knew that he couldn't sit idly by. He started the engine of the boat again, the sound of the motor breaking the silence that had settled over the river. He hadn't come out to fish that day, but as the boat slowly moved through the water, he found himself thinking about the river and its future. He had always caught fish in these waters, sold them, and lived a simple life. But it was clear to him now that he could not continue fishing in good conscience without taking action. How could he keep fishing in waters filled with pollution, knowing that the fish were dying or becoming sick from the toxic waste? How could he live with himself if he didn't do something to help? His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden voice calling from the shore. It was George, another local fisherman who had been a regular on the Mississippi for as long as Nicholas could remember. "Hey, Nick!" George waved his hand from the riverbank, grinning as he stepped into a small boat of his own. "You're out here early today. What's going on?" Nicholas pulled the boat closer to shore, leaning over the side to grab his friend's extended hand and help him climb aboard. George was a big man, with a weathered face that had seen decades of sun and rain. He had been a fixture on the river long before Nicholas, and he was one of the few people who truly understood the river's ways. "I don't know, George," Nicholas said slowly, shaking his head as he looked back at the water. I saw something today. Something that really got to me." George raised an eyebrow, his face creasing in concern. "What do you mean? What happened?" Nicholas explained what had happened with the swan, the plastic bag around its neck, the struggle, and how he had rescued it. He told George about the growing sense of helplessness that had started to take root in him, and the overwhelming guilt he felt about the state of the river. "I've seen the trash, the pollution, for years, George," Nicholas said, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "But today, it just hit me. The river's sick, and it's been sick for a long time. We're all just ignoring it, and it's getting worse. That swan was just one example, but how many more are out there?" George listened silently, his eyes narrowing as he took in Nicholas's words. When he spoke, his voice was low and thoughtful. "You're right, Nick," he said finally. "We've all seen the river change. It's not like it used to be. The fish aren't as plentiful, and I've noticed fewer birds too. But what can we do? This is bigger than just us." Nicholas stared out at the water, his thoughts swirling. "We could start by cleaning up. Get people involved. There's got to be a way to make a difference, George. I can't just sit back and keep fishing like nothing's wrong." George looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You're right, Nick. But we're gonna need help, and we're gonna need a plan." Nicholas smiled, a small spark of hope igniting in him. "Then let's get to work." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Nicholas and George spent hours talking to other fishermen and locals who lived along the riverbanks. They told everyone they could about the dangers of pollution in the river and the growing environmental crisis that no one seemed to be talking about. Some people were skeptical, dismissing the idea of cleanup as a pipe dream. But others, including a few of the younger generation of fishermen, were eager to help. It wasn't long before they had a plan in place. Nicholas had contacted a local environmental group that specialized in river and lake cleanups. They agreed to send a team of volunteers to help organize the first official cleanup effort along the Mississippi. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was a start. They planned a large-scale operation for the following weekend, with volunteers coming from all over the area to help remove the plastic and other trash that had accumulated along the river's banks and in the water itself. Nicholas felt a surge of determination as he worked to get everything ready. He knew it was just the beginning, but it was a beginning nonetheless. They couldn't solve the entire problem in one day, but they could make an impact. And, he thought, if they could get others to care about the river as much as he did, maybe they could build something that would last. As he stood on the bank of the river later that week, looking out over the water, he felt a small but significant sense of pride. The river still had its problems, but he was no longer sitting idly by, letting it suffer. He was doing something, no matter how small it seemed. "Let's save this river," he whispered to himself, as the first rays of dawn broke over the water. As the weekend approached, Nicholas felt a mix of anticipation and anxiety. The first official cleanup effort along the Mississippi was about to begin, and there was still so much work to be done. The river was vast, and the pollution seemed endless. How could a small group of volunteers make any significant impact? And yet, as he stood on the riverbank, he could see the potential for change. He could feel the weight of the river's pollution, but he also felt a glimmer of hope. For the first time in years, he felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. The volunteers began arriving early on Saturday morning. Nicholas had spent the night organizing equipment and preparing supplies for the cleanup. The group was small at first, just a handful of local fishermen and a few volunteers from the environmental group. But as the morning wore on, more people trickled in. A few families with young children, some college students, and even some local business owners showed up, all eager to lend a hand. Nicholas was surprised by the turnout. It was clear that there was more interest in this cause than he had initially realized. He greeted each person with a smile and a firm handshake, feeling a sense of camaraderie building between them all. Despite the daunting task ahead, there was an undeniable energy in the air. They were united by a shared purpose: to protect the river, to preserve it for future generations, and to give the wildlife a chance to thrive once again. Emily, the young woman from the environmental group, was the one who took charge of the operation. Her enthusiasm was contagious, and she quickly organized the volunteers into teams. Some would work along the riverbanks, collecting trash, while others would head out into the water in boats to remove the debris floating along the surface. Emily's confidence was reassuring, and her passion for the cause was evident in every word she spoke. Nicholas had taken the lead on the water cleanup. His boat, though small, was the perfect size for navigating the narrower sections of the river, where much of the debris had accumulated. He had been on the water long enough to know where the most polluted areas were, and he was determined to make a difference. As he cruised down the river, he was struck by just how much trash was floating in the water. Plastic bags, bottles, old fishing nets, and even large pieces of wood and styrofoam. Everything that shouldn't have been there was. It was overwhelming. Every time he removed one piece of trash, there seemed to be 5 more in its place. The pollution was relentless, and it felt like a never-ending battle. But as he worked, something unexpected happened. The birds began to return: swans, geese, ducks, and even eagles. He hadn't seen them in years, or at least not in the numbers he was seeing now. It was as if they were coming back, cautiously at first, but slowly gaining confidence. The cleanup had only just begun, and yet he could already see a change. As the hours passed, Nicholas worked tirelessly, hauling in bags of plastic and debris. He worked alongside the other volunteers, and despite the exhausting physical labor, there was a sense of purpose in everything they did. No one complained about the heat or the sweat. No one grumbled about the long hours. Everyone was focused on the same goal: to restore the river to its former glory. By the time the sun began to set, the group had made a noticeable difference. The riverbanks, once littered with trash, were now clean. The boats had been cleared of most of the debris, and the volunteers had gathered over a dozen large trash bags filled with plastic, paper, and other waste. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Nicholas stood at the water's edge, his hands on his hips, surveying the work that had been done. He was tired, sore, and covered in dirt, but he felt a sense of accomplishment that he hadn't felt in years. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. "You did good work today," George said, clapping him on the back. "I've seen this river like this for decades, and I can't remember the last time I've seen it this clean." Nicholas smiled, his face streaked with sweat. "It's not over yet, George. We've got a long way to go, but this is a start." The following week, word of the cleanup spread throughout the town, and more volunteers showed up to help. The momentum from the first day had sparked something in the community, a recognition that the river was worth saving, that the wildlife was worth protecting. The group continued to meet every weekend, gradually expanding their efforts. With each passing day, the river grew cleaner, and with it, the sense of hope and purpose that Nicholas had begun to feel. It wasn't just about the river anymore. It was about the community coming together to make a change. It was about preserving the river for future generations, for the fish, the birds, and the people who depended on it. Nicholas realized that this project, this movement, had become much more than he had ever expected. It wasn't just about cleaning up the river. It was about healing something that had been broken for far too long. One afternoon, as Nicholas was working along the riverbank, he spotted a familiar sight, a pair of swans gliding effortlessly across the water. They were beautiful, their wings spread wide as they soared over the river, their long necks curving gracefully. Nicholas stopped for a moment to watch them, a smile tugging at his lips. It was the same pair he had seen months ago, the ones he had rescued from the plastic bag. He watched as they flew higher and higher, disappearing into the blue sky. For the first time, he didn't feel sadness when he saw them. He felt pride. The river was healing, and so were the creatures that called it home. Later that evening, as he sat with the volunteers around a campfire by the river, George raised his glass in a toast. "To the river," he said, his voice gruff but filled with gratitude. "And to all of us who are working to bring it back." The group raised their glasses in unison, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of the fire. For Nicholas, it felt like a new beginning. He had spent years fishing the waters of the Mississippi, but now, for the first time, he felt truly connected to it. It wasn't just about the fish anymore. It was about the river itself, and everything that lived within it. Nicholas knew the work wasn't over. There was still much to be done, and the river would need their care and attention for years to come. But he was no longer alone in his efforts. He had found a community of people who cared as much as he did. People who were willing to fight for the river, just as he was. And as the sun set behind the river, casting its golden light over the water, Nicholas felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in a long time. For the first time in years, he was hopeful. The river was healing, and so was he. The following Saturday morning was crisp, and the sun hung low in the sky, casting golden light over the rippling waters of the Mississippi. The cleanup initiative, now in full swing, had drawn even more volunteers than before. It was clear that the movement to save the river had begun to gather real momentum. The message had spread beyond the small group of local fishermen. People from nearby towns had heard about the effort, and the river's story had captured their attention. Nicholas stood on the riverbank, adjusting his gloves, scanning the small crowd of volunteers. The energy in the air was palpable, a mix of excitement and determination. Some were seasoned environmentalists, while others were just local families who had never really given much thought to the river's condition until now. Some of the volunteers were older, with gray hair and weathered faces, their backs hunched from years of hard work. Others were younger, filled with the fresh enthusiasm of those just beginning to recognize the importance of preserving their natural surroundings. Emily, the young woman who had been instrumental in organizing the first cleanup, was already rallying the group, dividing them into teams. She moved quickly, her bright eyes scanning the volunteers and assigning them tasks, her energy infectious. "Okay, folks, we're going to tackle the worst hit sections today," she called out to the group. "We've already made a great start, but there's still a long way to go. I want half the team to head out on the boats, and the rest of you will work the banks. We need to clear the debris. Every little bit counts." Nicholas watched her as she moved between the teams, giving out instructions and motivating people. He could see why the volunteers were so drawn to her. She had a natural leadership about her, a confidence that made people want to follow her. There was no question in their minds that she believed in this cause, and that belief was contagious. Nicholas had initially been hesitant to get involved with a group of strangers, unsure of how he would fit in with the younger, more passionate crowd. But as the weeks had passed, he had started to see the power of community action. The people here were no longer strangers. They were all working toward the same goal. And in that shared purpose, he had found something he hadn't even realized he was looking for: connection. He walked over to this group of fishermen, including George, who were organizing the boats. You ready to get back out there? Nicholas asked, clapping George on the back. George grinned, his face crinkling with age. You bet I am. You know, I thought of this river would never change. But seeing all these people coming out here, well, it's a damn sight better than watching it slowly die, that's for sure. Nicholas smiled and nodded. Yeah, it feels good to be doing something about it, doesn't it? You bet, George said with a wink. Now let's get to work. The boat trip that morning was intense, but it was also strangely satisfying. Nicholas, along with 2 other volunteers, spent the morning navigating the river's narrow, overgrown channels. The water was still thick with debris, plastic bags, bottles, old fishing lines, and the occasional piece of abandoned furniture. It felt endless at times, as though no matter how much they collected, the river was always ready to give them more. Despite the overwhelming task, there was something therapeutic about the work. Nicholas found himself focusing on the small victories, the moment he cleared an entire stretch of shoreline, or when the last bag of trash was hauled into the boat. Slowly but surely, they were making a difference, one piece of plastic at a time. Emily's voice echoed over the radio, cutting through the sound of the motor. Hey guys, good work. Just remember, this isn't a sprint, it's a marathon. Keep at it. We'll take a break in a few hours, but for now, let's keep clearing. Nicholas nodded to himself, the rhythm of the work becoming almost meditative. He had spent many years fishing on these waters, but never had he felt so connected to the river. This wasn't just about fishing anymore. It was about protecting the very thing that had given him so much over the years. The more he worked, the more he realized just how much he owed to the river, to the creatures that lived within it, and to the community that had come together to save it. As they rounded a bend in the river, they spotted something unusual. An old, rusted car half submerged in the water. It was barely visible, hidden by a cluster of overgrown weeds. Nicholas couldn't believe his eyes. How had it gotten there? Look at that! One of the volunteers called out. A damn car in the river! Nicholas cursed under his breath. It's going to take a lot more work to clean this stretch, but we'll get it done. The team carefully maneuvered the boat around the car, taking note of its location for future cleanup efforts. It was just another example of the kind of damage humans had caused to the river over the years. But despite the frustration it caused, Nicholas knew that it was a reminder of how much work lay ahead. Every piece of trash, every large obstacle they found, was a step closer to restoring the river to its natural state. After a few more hours of hard work, the team reconvened on the banks of the river. They gathered the collected debris and packed it into large bags that would later be hauled off to recycling centers. The river, although far from perfect, was starting to look better, cleaner. As the volunteers sat down to rest and drink some water, Nicholas looked out over the water. It was hard to believe how much they had accomplished in just a few short weeks. It wasn't perfect, but the progress was undeniable. Emily came over to join him, sitting down on a nearby rock. She wiped the sweat from her brow and let out a long breath. "How's it going?" she asked, her eyes glinting with exhaustion but also pride. Nicholas shrugged, glancing at the river. "It's going well. We've still got a long way to go, but I think we're on the right track." Emily nodded. "We'll get there. It's going to take time, but we'll get there. We're not the only ones who care. More people are noticing, and the word is spreading. I think we're starting to make a real impact." Nicholas smiled. "I think so too." For the first time in a long while, he felt a deep sense of hope. The river wasn't just something to fish in anymore. It was a part of him, and it was part of something much bigger. They were all working towards something together, and the more he worked with the volunteers, the more he realized that it was about more than just the cleanup. It was about rebuilding a connection to the land, to the water, and to each other. As the day wore on and the sun began to dip lower in the sky, Nicholas couldn't help but think that this was just the beginning. He had found a new purpose, something that went beyond fishing. And in the process, he had found a community of people who shared his passion for protecting the river. Together, they were making a difference. The days that followed were marked by a sense of quiet but relentless determination. The cleanup effort had become an essential part of Nicholas's life, and every weekend, he was on the river, working alongside volunteers and fellow fishermen, all of them united by a shared goal. What had started as a small initiative had evolved into something far more substantial. More people were showing up to help each week, and word of the effort was spreading beyond the local community. Even nearby towns were beginning to notice, and it was clear that the project had become something of a symbol, a beacon of hope for the river. On one particularly hot Saturday morning, Nicholas stood on the riverbank, surveying the area they were about to tackle. It had been a long week, and he could feel the weariness in his bones. But there was a fire in him now, one that burned brighter than the exhaustion. The work was grueling, but it felt purposeful. Every piece of trash they removed was a small victory, and every piece they missed was a reminder that there was still much work to do. "We've got our work cut out for us today," George said as he approached, his grizzled face set in a grim line. "But we're making a difference. Look at the river. It's cleaner than it's been in years." Nicholas nodded, taking in the sight of the once polluted stretch of water. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but the difference was noticeable. The water was clearer, the banks less cluttered with plastic bags and discarded items. Birds had returned in larger numbers, and the fish population, though still fragile, was starting to show signs of recovery. It was slow progress, but it was progress nonetheless. Over the next few hours, the volunteers worked tirelessly. Some waded into the river to collect trash, while others worked the banks, gathering bags of plastic and old debris. Nicholas was on the boat again, maneuvering through the narrower parts of the river where the trash often accumulated in piles. His hands were sore from the constant work, but he didn't mind. He was doing something meaningful, something that mattered. As he navigated the boat down the river, he saw a familiar sight, a family of swans gliding gracefully across the water. The same pair of swans he had saved months ago was now raising their young on the same stretch of river. Nicholas couldn't help but smile. The sight of the swans was a sign, a confirmation that the river was healing, that the work they were doing was not in vain. It wasn't just the swans. The river was full of life again. Ducks had returned, and in the deeper parts of the river, he could see fish swimming beneath the surface. For the first time in years, it felt like the river had come back to life. Nicholas had seen firsthand the damage pollution could do, but now he was witnessing the river's resilience. The work wasn't easy, and it was far from finished, but the results were tangible. At lunchtime, the group gathered along the riverbank for a short break. They had been working for hours, and despite the sweat and grime, there was a palpable sense of accomplishment. The trash bags piled high on the shore were evidence of their hard work. George sat beside Nicholas, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. "Look at all this," George said, gesturing to the trash bags. "It's unbelievable, really. I never thought we'd make this much of a difference. But look at the water now. It's cleaner than I've seen it in years." Nicholas took a deep breath, watching the river flow past. He felt a sense of pride swelling in his chest. It wasn't just the river that had been cleaned up. It was the community, too. The volunteers who had come together to make this happen, the people who had believed in the cause from the beginning, had proven that change was possible. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't fast, but it was happening. "I never thought I'd see the day when we'd be able to make this kind of difference," Nicholas said quietly, his voice almost lost in the sounds of the river. "I've spent so many years just fishing, just being part of the river without really thinking about what it needed. But now, it feels different." George smiled knowingly. "I hear you. It's easy to just go along with the flow, so to speak. But when you see the damage, when you see what's happening to the river, you can't ignore it anymore." Nicholas nodded. "It's like we've been given a second chance. We're cleaning it up, but we're also giving it the chance to heal. And that's something worth fighting for." The following weeks brought more of the same. The group worked tirelessly, slowly but surely making progress. But it wasn't just about removing trash anymore. They had started organizing educational programs for local schools, teaching children about the importance of keeping the river clean and how even small actions could make a big difference. There were more community cleanup days, and with each one, more and more people showed up to help. The movement had grown beyond just a few dedicated individuals. It had become a community effort, a shared responsibility. One Saturday afternoon, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Emily gathered everyone for a brief meeting. The air was thick with the sweet scent of summer, and the sounds of the river seemed to hum with life. "We've made incredible progress," she said, her voice carrying across the group. "But we can't stop now. The river still needs us. We're seeing real results, but there's so much more to do. So let's keep going. We're not done yet." Nicholas stood quietly at the back of the group, listening to Emily's words. He had seen firsthand what they were capable of, and he knew that they had the power to keep pushing forward. The river had become a symbol of resilience, not just for the environment, but for the people who cared enough to protect it. As the group disbanded for the evening, Nicholas found himself walking along the riverbank alone. The sounds of the volunteers gradually faded as they packed up for the night, but Nicholas remained. He stood at the edge of the water, his gaze fixed on the river as the last rays of sunlight glinted off its surface. The swans were gone now, having flown off to their nests for the evening. But the river was still there, flowing, alive, and full of potential. He thought about how far they had come, how much the river had changed since the first cleanup day, how much the community had changed, and he thought about what the future might hold. There was still so much work to be done, so much to protect, but for the first time in years, Nicholas felt a sense of peace. The river was healing, and with it, so were the people who had come together to save it. The work was far from over, but as Nicholas stood there by the water, he knew one thing for certain. The river was worth every ounce of effort. And as long as there were people like him, people who cared enough to make a difference, it always would be. The first frost of autumn had settled over the Mississippi River. The trees lining the banks were just beginning to turn shades of amber and gold, their leaves gently falling into the river. There was a crispness in the air that signaled change, a season's end, and with it, a time to reflect on the work that had been done. The volunteers had worked hard all summer, tirelessly cleaning up the river. But now the chill of winter was creeping in, and the river seemed to slow down, preparing for the long, cold months ahead. For Nicholas, it had been a transformative year. What had begun as a small initiative to clean up the river had turned into something far bigger, something that had not only revitalized the river, but had brought an entire community together. He had found purpose again, and with that purpose had come a sense of peace that he hadn't known in years. He no longer saw the river as just a source of fish. It was a living entity, a place worth fighting for. And now, as the season shifted, so too did the mood of the river. The swans that had once been trapped in plastic bags now glided across the water without fear. They had returned, and they had come to stay. Nicholas had seen them with his own eyes, and each time they returned to the river, he felt a sense of accomplishment. It was proof that the river was healing. It was proof that all the effort had been worth it. But the work wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The river cleanup effort had grown beyond just a few local volunteers. Word of the initiative had spread far and wide, reaching other towns and even cities. More and more people were joining the cause, and the once small group of volunteers had turned into a movement. It wasn't just about cleaning the river anymore. It was about preserving the environment for future generations. And with each new volunteer, each new cleanup day, the community grew stronger. Nicholas had begun to see the fruits of their labor. The water was clearer. Fish were returning. Birds, once driven away by the pollution, were now abundant again. The air smelled fresher. The sounds of wildlife had returned, and for the first time in years, the river was alive again. It wasn't just about the cleanup. It was about reconnecting with the land, with the water, with the creatures that called it home. One evening, as Nicholas sat alone on the riverbank, watching the sun set over the water, he thought about how far they had come. The river that had once seemed so broken was now a place of hope, a symbol of resilience and renewal. He had never imagined that something as simple as picking up trash could have such a profound impact, but it had. The river, the birds, the fish, all of it was healing. And with each new piece of trash they removed, they were not just cleaning the river, they were giving it back its voice. He glanced over at the family of swans that had become a regular sight on the river. The mother and father glided along the water with their cygnets following close behind. Nicholas smiled to himself. They had made it. They had all made it. As he stood up and dusted the dirt from his jeans, he heard a voice behind him. It was Emily, who had been working alongside him for months. Her face was flushed from the cool air, and her eyes sparkled with the same energy and optimism that had first drawn him to the cause. "Hey, Nick," she said, coming to stand next to him. "I was just thinking about how far we've come. Can you believe it?" Nicholas turned to her, smiling. "I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. It's been a long road, but look at the river. It's beautiful again." Emily nodded, her gaze following the path of the swans. "It really is. And it's not just the river. It's everything. Our community, the people who've come together to make this happen. It's like we've all woken up." Nicholas felt a deep sense of pride as he looked at Emily. She had been the spark that ignited this whole movement. Without her passion and determination, they would never have gotten as far as they had. The community had come together because of her, and now, the river was starting to come back to life. "This is just the beginning," Nicholas said, his voice filled with quiet confidence. "We've made a real difference, but there's still so much to do. The river needs constant care. It can't just be about cleaning it up once and walking away. We've got to keep working, keep protecting it. But I think we're ready." Emily looked at him and smiled. "We'll be ready. Together." They stood in silence for a moment, watching as the sun dipped lower behind the horizon. The river was a tapestry of warm colors, the reds and oranges of the setting sun reflecting on the surface. The swans glided across the water, their wings graceful and effortless. Nicholas could hear the sound of birds calling out in the distance and the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. The world seemed at peace, and for the first time in a long time, Nicholas felt that peace deep within himself. It had been a long, hard road to get here. There had been days when it seemed like the cleanup would never end, when the river would never heal. But now, as he watched the wildlife return to the water, he knew that they had accomplished something monumental. They had given the river back its life. They had given the creatures that called it home the chance to thrive again. And in doing so, they had given themselves the opportunity to reconnect with the world around them. The following spring, the river was even more vibrant than before. The trees were blooming, the flowers were bursting into color, and the sound of birdsong filled the air. Nicholas stood on the banks of the river once more, taking it all in. The river had changed, and so had he. What had started as a small act of kindness, a simple rescue of a trapped swan, had grown into a movement that had changed the fate of an entire ecosystem. He looked out over the water, watching the swans glide gracefully through the currents. They were free now, and so was the river. Nicholas had given everything he had to this cause, and in return, the river had given him something he hadn't known he was missing. A sense of belonging, a sense of purpose. He was part of something greater than himself, and that was enough. As the swans soared into the sky, their wings cutting through the air with effortless grace, Nicholas knew that the work wasn't finished. But for the first time, he didn't feel overwhelmed. He felt hopeful. The river was alive, and so was he.